Okay. Hey. You did. Good, okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. And before I proceed, I want to yield for a minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to get her to get up from her machine. But I have an intern that just started with me, Camille Sola Rosada, from Puerto Rico. So she's here at the perfect time. Raise your hand so they can see you.
Great to see you.
Okay.
Welcome to the Rules Committee. Thank you. Well, today we're here considering three measures. The first is a resolution disapproving of this administration's move to illegally turn Medicaid into a block grant system for adults in the expansion population. If President Trump gets his way, many Medicaid recipients could lose access to life-saving medications or other benefits scaled back. The president is allergic to people getting health care, but this majority will not let his latest scheme to limit access to health coverage go unanswered. The second is a supplemental appropriations bill to support Puerto Rico after a series of devastating earthquakes. It will help invest in education, rebuild infrastructure, and support community development block grants. The House will support our fellow American citizens in Puerto Rico as they work to rebuild. The third is a bill to strengthen the middle class at a time when Americans are working too hard for too little. Every time the stock market goes up, I hear the president talk as though all Americans are seeing the benefits. But here's the truth. Corporations and the wealthy may be thriving, but most Americans are not. Over the past 3 decades, the average income for the wealthiest 1% has nearly doubled. But the average income for the bottom 90% of families has increased just 1%. 1%. People are struggling to afford the essentials as the cost of housing, child care, and education continue surging. We know that when workers stand together and negotiate with their employer, wages increase, benefits are strengthened, and working conditions are made safer. It is no secret that some people feel threatened when workers are empowered. That's why conservative state legislatures have chipped away at workers' ability to stand together. Special interests and corporate lobbyists have been handed the pen to write one anti-worker bill after the next, all while talk radio hosts regularly demonize the union movement. But unions built this country. If a worker today wants to join this movement, they should be able to do so. That's what the PRO Act is all about, strengthening workers' ability to stand together and negotiate for a better future. It's a major step toward creating an economy that helps all Americans, not just the well-off and the well-connected. And let me just say to everybody here, we have 3 bills to get through here, and many witnesses, and we're going to have votes at around 4:30 or 5. I have a dream that maybe we can all get this done before we have votes.
Is that because it's Black History Month?
But that requires us all to be a little bit more disciplined, and that includes the witnesses who were thrilled to have you here today. And so our first panel is, we'll begin with Chairman Frank Pallone of New Jersey.
I get to make it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought your remarks actually were directed.
I was so anxious to get moving, I neglected to acknowledge the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
I'm slow, but I got that one, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing covers 3 different items: a supplemental disaster appropriations bill, a bill to protect big unions at the expense and the right of individual workers, and a non-binding resolution to once again oppose President Trump. These are very different items, but they do have one common thread. They reflect the majority's stubborn insistence on continuing to make political points over making law. The first bill I'll address, H.R. 2474, which the majority claims is intended to protect the right of workers to organize, but which is really a union boss's wish list. With every provision in the bill, H.R. 2474 prioritizes union bosses over workers and businesses. Consider some of the following provisions. The bill would remove personally identifying information protections from workers nationwide. If this bill were to become law, workers would have no ability to decide not to share their personal information with union representatives. The bill also imposes a nationwide card check scheme, which would force workplaces to unionize upon receiving signed cards from 50% of employees without a secret ballot. I think we can see the flaws with these two provisions working together. Without the ability to protect one's personal information, and with giving the ability to organize just by soliciting a signed card from workers, employees may be subjected to bullying and harassment both at work and at home until they agree to go along with proposed organization plan, whether they actually support that plan or not. What's worth, the bill preempts every state right to work law across the country. 27 states, including my own home state of Oklahoma, have right to work laws in place that protect workers from being required to become members of labor organizations or to pay fees to one. H.R. 2474 ignores the will of the voters in each of these 27 states and wipes them all from the books. It's an egregious violation of state sovereignty. And the bill does even more. It changes the joint employer standard to expand by millions of workers the number of employees subjected to it, thus putting the entire franchise business model at risk. It overturns a decision of the NLRB and reimposes an Obama-era rule on micro-unions, which would allow bargaining units smaller than the workplace to exist. It codifies another old Obama-era rule on ambush elections, which could shorten the time between an election petition being filed and the election taking place down to as little as 11 days. At every turn, H.R. 2474 would pass into law every possible item on the union boss's wish list. And while I'm supportive of the right of employees to join together and form a union, I'm not supporting stacking the deck in favor of union bosses and making it easy for them to intimidate workers at their homes. I think we can do better than this, Mr. Chairman. If the majority were focused on making law instead of making points, I think we would find common ground on modernizing America's labor laws. Fortunately, that's not what the majority's chosen to do. Second item I would cover is H.R. 5687, the Emergency Supplemental Appropriations Bill that's ostensibly aimed at providing resources for Puerto Rico. I'm very reluctantly opposing the bill. I have to say that I'm disappointed that I must do so. I've spoken time and again on the need for Congress to provide emergency disaster resources as they are needed, since we never know which of our districts may be stricken next. The key point here is the phrase, as they are needed. Here, there does not actually appear to be an urgent or pressing need for this bill. Significant resources have already been provided for Puerto Rico in the wake of the disasters of 2017-2018, and much of those resources remain unspent. Further, the language of this bill is so vague that many of the dollars provided in it will not go to Puerto Rico at all. As resources are needed, and if they are properly directed to where they need to go, you'll find no one more enthusiastic than me to vote in favor of a disaster supplemental bill. But today's measure simply does not meet that test. We've yet to even receive the federal report, which would give us a true understanding of the extent of the damage. But my recommendation, Mr. Chairman, would be let's use the money we already have on hand, meet the immediate needs of people there. If we need more, come back. But let's not be throwing money at the problem when we still have billions of dollars that have been unspent. Finally, HRES 826 is the majority's sense of Congress resolution opposing the Trump administration's policies concerning Medicaid. I note it's mostly remarkable for what it does not say. It does not note, for example, the need to control the costs in the Medicaid program to make sure it is there for future generations. It does not note that the Trump administration is trying to focus the program on those who need it the most, children, pregnant women, and the disabled. And it does not note that the administration is trying to give states the flexibility they need to meet their own unique challenges. To be clear, Republicans in the House and the Trump administration support Medicaid. We support it being there for those who need it most, both today and into the future, and we support giving states the flexibility they need rather than imposing yet another one-size-fits-all mandate from Washington. But once again, the majority is choosing to make a political statement over making law, and with this non-binding sense of Congress resolution, that is literally what they have chosen, a political statement at the behest of leading Democratic presidential candidates and nothing more. What we're spending valuable time, or that we're spending valuable time at the Rules Committee and on the floor of the House on a non-binding political resolution. We could be tackling the opioid epidemic or infrastructure or national security or even legislation that would actually work to strengthen the Medicaid program. Shows exactly where the majority's priorities lie. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much for your statement. And now I will turn to the panel. We have with us the Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and Ms. McMorris Rogers is here as well. And again, please feel free to summarize your remarks, and we'll begin with Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't usually begin my remarks by responding to the ranking member, particularly someone who I respect like Congressman Cole, but I do want to say that your remarks do concern me, because part of the reason that I'm here today is because I do believe that the Republicans are trying to cut Medicaid, and that this is what this is all about, this block grant. And so when you say that you want to rein in Medicaid or save costs of Medicaid, which I know that this Trump administration has tried to do in their annual budgets, I mean, next week we're going to see the president's budget again, and for the last few years we've seen, $1 trillion worth of cuts in Medicaid, and that's my concern, that essentially this block grant, this effort to say that states can block grant Medicaid is exactly that. It's an effort to try to cut back on the program, which the GOP has been trying to do for a long time, and which has manifested itself in the president's budget for the last couple of years, and probably will again next year to the tune of next week to the tune of $1 trillion. And if anything, I think that when you mention the opioid crisis, this is the reason that as Democrats through the Affordable Care Act that we tried to expand Medicaid and get states to expand Medicaid, because it's one of the most effective ways of trying to cover people, most of whom work, but in the past have not been eligible for Medicaid because the guidelines were so low. So, I think there is a direct contradiction here in the sense of what the Republicans have been trying to do versus what I, as a Democrat, have been trying to do with Medicaid, which is to guarantee essential services, to make sure we don't have major cuts in the program, to expand it to people who are working but don't make enough money to be able to buy health insurance on the open market, and primarily to fight this opioid epidemic, because Medicaid is one of the best ways. When people have Medicaid, they can get screening, they can get treatment. And if you cut back on Medicaid or make fewer people eligible, then I think the opioid epidemic is only going to get worse. But let me try to summarize. I'll include my entire statement into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I do want to say that what we've seen by the GOP is essentially a war on Medicaid. Illegal work requirements that have led to over 18,000 people in just one state losing Medicaid, repealing access standards so it's more difficult for people to access Medicaid, cutting the budget, which I mentioned last year was $1 trillion. These are just some of the unprecedented attacks on Medicaid by the Trump administration. And, the president keeps saying, even last night, that he wants more people to have health insurance, but under his watch, the uninsured rate for children has gone up, reversing years of progress that we made with the Democratic administrations. Over 1 million kids have lost coverage through Medicaid and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, since President Trump took office. And it's just making it harder for people to get on and stay on Medicaid. Now, last Thursday, the Trump administration escalated its attack on Medicaid to a new level by issuing guidance that would allow states to block grant their Medicaid programs. This, and I want to be clear, is illegal. And one of the reasons that our committee is taking this directly to the floor is because it's clearly illegal. The law does not give the president the authority to do this. And a change of this magnitude requires an act of Congress. And in fact, the Republicans admitted that, because when they did the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, they specifically included a block grant to Medicaid in the legislative language. And we had hearings on hearings last year when the GOP were trying to repeal, or whenever it was that they were trying to repeal the ACA, and we had much discussion about block grants and how block grants were illegal and block grants were, the damaging impact of block grants. So, I don't see any reason for more hearings. I don't see any reason why we need to do anything but bring this to the floor and express the sense of Congress that this is an illegal action. Now, under federal law, the Secretary does not have the authority to waive Medicaid's financing structure. They can waive some things, but not the financial structure, which is what this is. Let me just say a few more things. Congressman Cohen, I don't mean to pick on you, but you spoke about it. He's tough in it. He doesn't care. I don't mean he doesn't care, but he doesn't care if I attack. He doesn't care if I attack him. Flexibility is there already. States have all the flexibility they want or that they need, in my opinion, and no two Medicaid programs in any state are alike. So it's not an issue of flexibility, in my opinion. What we have are federal guardrails that make sure that states cover services and drugs for the things that people actually need. And that's what's being pulled back by the Trump administration. These guardrails that I think by removing them, you're going to put beneficiaries at risk. Basically what this does is allow states to cut coverage, cut provider rates, increase copays, kick people off Medicaid, the whole limit, and it's not limited to the Medicaid expansion program under the ACA. It's for the Medicaid program in general, so they could actually kick off pregnant women and low-income parents. And to be perfectly honest, we not only have an opioid crisis, but we have a maternal mortality crisis. And Medicaid ensures that pregnant women and postpartum women get screenings and treatment. I already mentioned the opioid epidemic, so I'm not going to go into that again, Mr. Chairman. Let me just close by saying that I think that anything, it's really sad that this came out last week just before the State of the Union address. If you listen to the president last night, he said that he has an agenda for working class people. Nothing could be more contrary to the interests of the working class than block granting Medicaid. These are people that work, for the most part, need health insurance, and won't be able to get it if this happens. And I just want Congress to stand up to what the president is doing. It's totally illegal, and it's contrary to what he says. And yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the Rules Committee. This is why I've asked Chairman Pallone will be shortly, formally, Chairman Burgess, former Chairman of the Health Subcommittee, and I, for a hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee. We right here have a disagreement on what the proposal does. And I'm reading from what the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services said. They said the HSO is available to all states with a focus on a limited population, adults under age 65 who are not eligible for Medicaid on the basis of disability or the need for long-term care services and supports, and who are not eligible under a state plan. Basically, age, blind, disabled, pregnant women, those are not population that this opportunity would make available for states. So we have a disagreement right there. This is why we should follow regular order, Mr. Chairman. I know you're a very big believer in regular order, not rushing things to the floor without hearings, not giving us an opportunity to have a motion to recommit, which I hope you will assure we'll have for this resolution, as you did the last time I appeared before you. But I'm here today to, sadly, but strongly, voice opposition to House Resolution 826. This resolution, frankly, was hastily put together. It opposes the Healthy Adult Opportunity Initiative, the administration's proposal to modernize Medicaid. Let's start with the process, because this resolution did not go through regular order. There was no regular order on this process. Many members of Congress decided they disagreed with the administration's proposal before they had seen it. I would ask you, have you read the 56-page proposal? The letter. 36 House members sent a letter to Secretary Azar and Administrator Verma opposing the initiative before it was even released. This resolution was introduced Monday. No hearings, no markup, no opportunity for members of either party or for witnesses to participate, nothing. Instead of forging ahead with this partisan resolution, let's hold hearings where we can fully examine the administration's proposal. Maybe then we could be better informed on its effects before we're forced to vote and judge on it. A hearing would show that this initiative is voluntary. States do not have to participate in the program if they do not want to. All right? We should hear from the states who are innovating and how they would continue to provide quality care to their citizens. I don't know, many of you were probably in the state legislatures. We begged for these sorts of opportunities to innovate, especially in Oregon. I chaired the Rules Committee in Oregon. I helped lead a special task force that implemented the Oregon Health Plan so we could innovate. We have waivers. We have a waiver pending, 1115, before CMS at this moment, dealing with substance use disorder and treatment. Many states have those. Many of your states, if not all, have waivers, 1115 waivers. We should be asking our states to innovate and provide better, more affordable care. So what is the Healthy Adult Opportunity Initiative? It's a voluntary proposal that emphasizes the concept of value-based care while granting states extensive flexibility to administer and design their programs to fit the needs of their citizens. This optional initiative does not apply to children, it does not apply to seniors, or to those with disabilities. It applies to able-bodied single adults. In fact, the administration's proposal is a prepackaged set of flexibilities, most of which are already used by states in running their Medicaid programs. Now, we would know all that if we'd had a chance to have a hearing on the underlying proposal. The resolution that House Democrats want to put on the floor says the goal of the administration's proposal is to deprive Medicaid beneficiaries of health services. But the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services say that any state that wants to participate in this demonstration initiative will be expected, at a minimum, to provide coverage of items and services in the categories of the ACA's, Obamacare's essential health benefits, the EHBs, benefits such as 1, ambulatory patient services, 2, emergency services, hospitalization, maternity and newborn care, mental health and substance use disorder services, including behavioral health treatment, prescription drugs, rehabilitation and habilitative services and devices, laboratory services, preventive and wellness services, chronic disease management, pediatric services, including oral and vision care, which generally are not applicable for the populations that would be covered under any state that participates in the waiver opportunity. The resolution also asserts the initiative would roll back access standards. CMS expressly states that those who participate in the demonstration will be monitored to ensure health outcomes are achieved. So this resolution will never become law. In fact, it's not legislation. If you've got an issue with the legality of this, then let's go to the committee and hammer out a resolution there that's actually could become law. This is just a statement. The Health Adult Opportunity will not give states the ability to cap beneficiary enrollment or cut benefits. CMS is putting an expenditure cap on the waiver should a state choose to take this option. But the expenditure caps are fairly common in health programs. We should not ignore that point. For example, in the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, and many Section 1115 Medicaid demonstrations, of which more than 40 states are currently participating, already operate under a funding ceiling. And I want to make a comment about CHIP. It was under my leadership as chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee that we fully funded CHIP, not just for 5 years, which is what it had been before, but we passed one in the House for 6, and then we took it clear out to 10 years. CHIP, if memory serves me right, was a creation of Republicans to provide a partnership with states for children's health insurance program. It is fully funded for 10 years. That has never happened in the history of CHIP. That happened under Republican leadership. It happened under my leadership, and many Democrats voted against it along the way, I would add. I want to point out that while total federal spending will be capped, the waiver does not change the need for states to submit claims reflecting actual expenditures to obtain federal matching funds for the Medicaid program and to maintain health outcomes as under current law. Now again, states will not be allowed to cap enrollment and qualify for the statutory enhanced federal match rate for this expansion population. States will be required to provide quarterly and annual expenditure reports to demonstrate their financial performance relative to their budget agreement. And finally, to the extent a state achieves savings and demonstrates no declines in access or quality, CMS will share back a portion of the federal savings for reinvestment into Medicaid. The amount of shared savings available for reinvestment would increase based on the commensurate improvements in quality and access measures. Perhaps this sort of shared responsibility and incentives could help the people on the Medicaid program that they're intended to serve. Let me wrap it up with this. I agree that this is a major proposal. That's why we need a committee hearing at the Energy and Commerce Committee that has jurisdiction over Medicaid. where we can hear from the stakeholders as well as the administration. Then we can walk through the facts of the waiver opportunity. Instead, we're getting a hurried disapproval resolution that bypassed all committees other than this one. Let's do the work at the committee level to examine this proposal correctly. House Democrats say they're just as committed to regular order, yet time and again we come to the floor to debate bills or resolutions with no committee process, and it amounts to political theater. Instead of this resolution, we should be voting to end surprise billing. We should be debating how to avoid the Part D catastrophic cliff that Obamacare created. We have to address that. We should be considering bipartisan legislation to lower drug prices. Instead, we're going to take this up. No process. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I appreciate the opportunity to come and make my case. I hope you will agree to at least allow us a motion to recommit on the floor. You were generous about that in the past, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. I don't have any questions. Mr. Cole? Mr. Hastings?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record the American Heart Association's press release that includes a number of organizations, and because of time, I won't I'll point them all out. But it's the Heart Association, the Kidney Fund, the Liver Foundation, Lung Association. I mean, these are the people that do the groundwork, and if they are in opposition to the CMS guidance on Medicaid block grants, who are we to stand in their way? And very briefly, Mr. Chairman, 2 paragraphs from a letter led by Representative Castor, my colleague from Tampa, Florida. We wrote to the governor of the state of Florida the following. State of Florida is one of the last of a handful of states yet to expand Medicaid, and it is costing our state billions of dollars, many lives, and thousands of jobs. We urge you to develop a plan to bring billions of our taxpayer dollars home to serve our neighbors and boost our economy, and we pledge to work with you. Floridians value affordable health care. In fact, almost 2 million of our neighbors enrolled in the healthcare.gov marketplace for 2020, an increase from last year and more than any other state. Even with this good news, almost 1 million Floridians remain in the coverage gap who would qualify for coverage under Medicaid expansion. Florida is near the bottom of states for access and affordability of health care. And I don't have the time, nor would I want to take more of the committee's time. But I can tell you the death of women during childbirth is one of the most tragic consequences of us not doing our job with reference to especially poor people. It is a sad, sad state of affairs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will have an opportunity to talk about this a lot on the floor tomorrow, so I'll respect the chairman's dream on this. You know, and when I saw the panel, I thought, well, we're going straight into the second bill because both the chairman and the ranking member remember we had a field hearing in Puerto Rico in November of 2017 and really kind of dug into a lot of the things that are going to be covered in this other bill. And then for whatever reason, it has just fallen off our radar screen. And while I've got the two of you here, let me just say I think some follow-up into that work we did in Puerto Rico is probably going to be important because some of the things we'll be talking about with one of the other bills is just that, is the state of recovery.
Could I just respond to that before you get into this bill? The bill that you're going to consider today is a good bill, but I agree with you if that's what you're suggesting, and I've signaled that to our leadership that we do need to look at things long term. For example, the grid, which was one of the things that we saw. I mean, I think they need a new grid. I don't think we can. We have to do patchwork and we have to do certain things, but we really have to look at this long term, and I think that is something that the committee.
Yeah, I don't think the damage assessment included an assessment of the grid, at least not that I've seen.
No, but what I'm saying, Dr. Burgess, I don't want to take up the time, is that a lot of.
Oh, take your time. It's the Rules Committee. There's no.
Well, I know, because we got to have the dream here. But what I'm saying is that this is a good bill, and we should pass it. But I do think that our committee and maybe, the Congress in general has to look beyond to long-term concerns. I use the grid as one example. It may very well be that they need a new grid and not just continue to patch.
And Dr. Burgess, if I may respond as well, I led that congressional delegation trip down, not only to Puerto Rico, but also to the Virgin Islands, you remember. And those folks got hammered by the hurricanes. And now, of course, with Puerto Rico getting hammered by the earthquakes as well, it's really important that we do the assessment. It's important we hear back from the 30-day assessment we're waiting for from FEMA to find out what the issue really is, how bad the problem really is. And as you know, there's money allocated in that emergency fund. I think it's $40 billion, of which half of it's still there. Puerto Rico hasn't spent the money yet that they were given for the last go around. And finally, I would say it was under, again, just because this tends to get partisan here, Republican leadership. I led the effort to fully fund their Medicaid program at 100%. And we passed that into law. That was our effort as Republicans, and there were lots of Democrats voted against that, even though they clamored for it. It was kind of an odd situation. And so I think we should go back to Puerto Rico at the appropriate time, see the progress, see the new damage, and get a firsthand look here as well.
Well, I apologize for the diversion, just I couldn't help myself with both of you here. And we had done some work on that in our committee, and I think we should continue. Chairman Walden, on the issue of CHIP, and thank you for bringing that up. That was a significant achievement in the last Congress, and I was proud to help you with that and the 10-year funding, fully offset, did not add to the deficit. And CHIP can be a block grant, can it not?
It basically is that. I mean, it's a per capita for children. It's how states operate. Many of our programs are that way today. If you think transportation's that way, it's block grant to the states. States then have the ability to say, here's where we need it most. And CHIP operates that way. There are a couple others that do it. This is not unique, although I know the opponents of this flexibility for our states would want you to believe that, but it's not.
Well, and since it's been brought up, I mean, we tend to conflate the populations covered under Medicaid. The expansion population is different from the legacy population. Legacy population is covered generally by a smaller FMAP than the healthy adult which makes no sense, but nevertheless, that's the way things are. And that mandatory population would not be affected even if a state said, I would choose to do this for our expansion population. They may not do it for the mandatory population. Do I have that correct, Mr. Chairman?
That is close. This applies to the expansion population. There is a very narrow subset you could get to in the mandatory, but not age, blind, disabled, pregnant women, all of that. Predominantly, you're dealing with the expansion population, which is about 12% of Medicaid. And so it's in those states that have expansion population. Again, 40 states use waivers, including my own, and they're, again, back for new waivers. And basically what this is making it easier for other states to do what has already been granted to another state.
I mean, I would disagree with that, but I don't know if you want to hear from me.
Well, I'd like to have a hearing, then we could work it out.
Look, the bottom line is it doesn't, it will apply to a regular Medicaid population, not everybody, but certainly some. And look, let me just give you an example. For example, you have 5 million people with disabilities that could be subject to the proposed waivers because the guidance only excludes beneficiaries who receive federal disability assistance. There are millions of people with chronic conditions or serious health needs that don't qualify for federal disability insurance. Then he says parents, millions of low-income parents could be subject to the waivers. And when the parents lose coverage, oftentimes the children go uninsured. I get those cases all the time in my office. And then the other thing is, while Medicare-eligible seniors would be excluded, older adults, including early retirees receiving Social Security but not yet eligible for Medicare, could be affected. So it does apply not to all of the regular Medicaid population, but certainly to a significant amount. But the point is that, I'm only going to answer your question. My point is that we've had this discussion, and the reason that block grants are not good is because, unlike other waivers, it would allow states to do things like eliminate eligibility, cut provider payments, increase co-pays, all those things that make it more difficult for people to access health care.
Yes, Mr. Walden.
Dr. Burgess, I would just say, this is why we're pleading for a hearing on this proposal. We have not had a hearing on this proposal from the administration. We have not heard from Director SEMA, Administrator SEMA, Verma. We should. My friend, the chairman, and I disagree on what we think this proposal does, and we've been briefed at a pretty high level here. And it's a very different view of what the proposal does. And here, we're going to have a resolution to say we don't like it, sense of Congress. I mean, come on, put out a press release. If you want to legislate, let's go legislate, but let's start the way we all know is the best way, especially in the long tradition of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Let's have a hearing. Let's bring the administration in. Let's say, show us the facts, and then hammer it out. You can dislike block grants, I get it. We do that a lot in healthcare and every other part of the government. Again, when I was a state legislator, we begged for this opportunity, and we finally got it in 1991 under the Oregon Health Plan. We had to fight Henry Waxman at the time, and the Department of Health and Human Services, with all due respect, wasn't run nearly as strongly there. There you go, see? There you go.
But again, Dr. Burgess, briefly, we had so many hearings and discussion about this when the GOP wanted to repeal the ACA. And they clearly had to put in language in the ACA repeal, whatever the title was that you called that bill, that that said you could do this. So if you didn't think that it needed to be done legislatively rather than by executive guidance, then why would you have put it in the ACA to allow the block grants? And we had the discussions about how that was necessary. It had
I'm
to
just
be
reclaiming my time. If you feel strongly about that, I would ask, why not have a legislative hearing, pass some legislation? This is the technical equivalent of sending a get-well card to Medicaid, and it will have the same effect because it goes nowhere after it's heard on the
I don't
floor
know
on
if
Friday.
anything has an effect on this administration, but I think it's important for Congress to express the fact that we don't think this is legal and we don't think it's a good idea.
That's where we have a difference of opinion, and that's why the Congress is supposed to come together and figure these things out. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say that I am very much in support of this resolution and very much against any block grant move to cut Medicaid benefits or any health care benefits, certainly to my constituents in California. But I do have a question for you, Mr. Chairman, and that is on March of 2019, a federal judge invalidated the president's attempt to add work requirements in Kentucky and Arkansas. So by creating a block grant program, this will put the administration on the driver's seat to dictate to states how they should implement their Medicaid program. Is that correct? Can you talk a
That
little bit
is
about
correct. And again, I know that many times the Republican leadership or the president suggest, oh, what's wrong with having work requirements? People should work if they want Medicaid. But again, the fact of the matter is that many people who are not technically, on disability, right, still have chronic conditions and other problems that make it very
The
difficult.
working poor.
Right. And these are people there. So why are we doing these things, right? We don't have any reason to believe that there's a widespread, corruption or fraud, and that the people that are working and have disabilities, even though they're working, are cheating the system. So why is it that we start putting all these requirements on that limit eligibility? And that's the same problem with the block grant. It's going to let them basically, cut back on eligibility, cut back on payments to providers, make poor people or low-income people pay more out of pocket. All those things would be allowed under this guidance.
California, and I'm very proud of the work that California has done to embrace the Affordable Care Act, to expand on health care for all of our residents in California. And in no way do I want to participate in a program that will mandate to the California legislature how and who gets to have health care coverage. certainly when we are looking at international threats with viruses that are killing people all over the world, this is just another way and another way that this administration is facilitating a momentum to back up and backfill our budget, the huge deficit the Republicans created when they passed the tax scam on the backs of the poor people, and certainly the poor people in California's 31st Congressional District, working poor, by the way. First, we're going to cut food stamps. Next, we're going to block grant their health care. What are we going to do after that? So I stand in full support of this, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming to testify. Like you, Mr. Walden, I served in the state legislature in the House and the Senate, and I served on the Senate Health Committee. And yeah, I am a big supporter of state rights. We talked about this a lot, and in Arizona we did Medicaid expansion, but we also tried to do some waivers to try to for able-bodied adults. And so I agree with you on that. I appreciate that you pointed out this is for able-bodied adults. It's not for disabled people, pregnant women, children, anything like that. The question I have actually is for Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, I'm reading this, and I understand we have policy disagreements. I understand that a lot of my Democratic colleagues don't like President Trump, right? But why is it always necessary? Like, I'm reading on page 3 of this, and there's this rhetoric in here, whereas once in office, President Trump has gone further than any president in history to make life harder for working families, and then has waged an unrelenting war on Medicaid. I mean, this seems very subjective to me. I mean, why do you... Why does this always have to be added? I mean, why don't we try to work together and not do all this rhetoric all the time?
Well, look, I have to be honest with you. If I had a hard time last night staying in the chambers, okay, because I really felt that the president last night was declaring war on anyone who didn't disagree with him. So to use the term unrelenting war on Medicaid, given the level of cutbacks, last year's budget was $1 trillion cut. Work requirements, eliminating access through changing the standards. I really do think it is a war on Medicaid, and I would love to get back to the day when, look, if Greg Walden were the president of the United States or Mike Burgess, then maybe I wouldn't use the term war. But I think the president is conducting a war on Medicaid. I really do.
Well, it would be nice if we could tone down some rhetoric and actually get things done instead of doing impeachment for a year. But yes, Mr. Walden.
Just to follow up, and I appreciate your comments, I just want to make clear, especially my friend from California, there's nothing in the president's guidance or CMS guidance that is a mandate on states. These are options. In fact, California has a waiver. Most of our states have different waivers. And so what they're proposing is the state of California would come to CMS, here are clear guidelines and more flexibility. California doesn't have to do that. They can keep doing just what they're doing. But if they have a bright idea about how to deliver services better to the working poor, this would facilitate and make it easier for California to come to Washington, whoever's in the administration. Be the next one if they maintain the same deal. 40 states use waivers. We've used them in Oregon. We got one pending. Substance use disorder treatment. There's a lot going on in this space. States are great innovators, and we cover a lot of people in Oregon. So I know you're trying. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
But in California, it's not going to happen in New Jersey, but it's going to happen to a lot of these people who are in these states that have not expanded Medicaid, and where the legislature or the governor may decide to do this. I mean, hopefully nobody does, but that's where it's going to happen. And maybe I shouldn't worry about what happens in Alabama, but I am worried about it.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. Ms. Lesko is right. I mean, the editorial comments and the rhetoric, it isn't helpful. And I didn't like the president's speech last night. There's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of editorial comments that doesn't get us over the hump to get things done for Americans. Mr. Walden, I think you're right. I mean, this is kind of at least, I was going to say age-old, but decades-old kind of difference that we have between the parties, between block grants and, federal administration. Our fear is that when you block grant stuff, all of a sudden you find a lot of fraud, the potential for fraud on a state-by-state basis, that the people who you want to have the benefits don't get the benefits. And so there is a difference of opinion on that. And you may be right. Maybe there should have been a hearing, but maybe there should have been consultation with the Congress before, going from a federal approach to a block grant approach. So I just appreciate the testimony. Ms. Lesko and I don't agree very often, but I do think for all of us to try and reduce some of the unneeded rhetoric will help us get to at least, maybe agreement or clear disagreement. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think Mr. Pallone has spoken very forcefully in a way that comprehends my policy suspicions about this move to block grants. I think it will undermine the ability of the most vulnerable people in lots of parts of America to access the Medicaid coverage that they need. And as Mr. Perlmutter just said, it will also expose the program to fraud. My major concern right now, actually, is that what the administration is proposing to do by administrative fiat is absolutely outside of the law. And I want to underscore the point that there was an effort to do this legislatively in 2017, right when the Trump administration came into office, and they were looking for every conceivable executive order and administrative decision they could take to change policy in the most radical way possible. And at that point, they didn't even dream that this was something that they could do legislatively. There was an effort to put it in the Affordable Care Act, and it was rejected. So having failed to do that, now suddenly they discover that they've got the King Kong power to impose block grants through the Medicaid program, when before their clear understanding was that it needed to be done legislatively. And it reminds me very much of when Congress rejected on a bipartisan basis, I seem to recall, the president's effort to spend billions of dollars on the wall, and not taking no for an answer from the lawmaking branch of the government. He simply decided to start rechanneling money from other programs that had been allocated for other purposes to do it. So I think this is another outburst of lawlessness by this president and by this administration. I would think that members on both sides of the aisle would reject this usurpation of legislative power and the overriding of what the statute says. So we can disagree about the underlying policy, but I would hope that all of us would reject this very clear effort to steal power from Congress and simply to impose by administrative fiat what they were unable to accomplish legislatively. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
My other colleagues want to add anything? Ms. Shalala?
I did read the proposal. I thought it was 60 pages. I read the whole thing. This is simply an attack on the Affordable Care Act. We've been through this before. That is trying to block grant Medicaid. There's a whole history on this kind of block granting. There's lots of flexibility in existing law to write waivers. But what you can't do is you can't cut eligibility, you can't cut coverage. And in fact, this reg that they've put out actually doesn't say you have to cover people under current Medicaid law, but under the ACE law, which is less coverage than Medicaid. If you read it carefully, it would allow the states, and I'm in favor of flexibility. When Oregon couldn't get that waiver, I did the waivers. I did waivers every 2 weeks because I believe in states being able to innovate. But I don't believe that they should be able to cut eligibility or the quality of the coverage in the process. If they want a different delivery system, as Oregon did, as Arkansas did, and a whole bunch of states did, that's fine. We ought to experiment with that. But this is not legal because the Medicaid program is a state federal program. But this debate is not about flexibility because the secretary has that authority under existing Medicaid law. But I think block grants would put the states in terrible situation, particularly for this particular population, even though it looks narrow. If there's an epidemic or if there's a change in the economy, that cap would either the states would have to put their own money in or they'd have to come back to the federal government. So I have always opposed flat block grants, but I do believe in flexibility.
Thank you very much. No further questions. We'll now turn to Ms. McMorris-Rogers. You're more than welcome to stay if you want to listen to more testimony. Or you can leave. You can be excused.
I might listen to her testimony and then I think you're on the same issue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the committee. Given the discussion, I think it underscores the importance of having a legislative hearing on this resolution, because there is a vast disagreement over what the resolution, what the underlying proposed policy by the administration would actually do as it relates to Medicaid. And unfortunately, this resolution is being used to create fear and to create misinformation for those that depend upon a very important safety net called Medicaid. And we should be working on bipartisan solutions to improve and strengthen Medicaid. We all know it was created in 1965. It's an important partnership between the states and federal government that provides care to some of the most vulnerable populations in our country. And Dr. Burgess pointed out that currently the federal government is paying between 50 and 76% for people with disabilities, children, pregnant women, and the elderly, 90% for the cost of the able-bodied people earning up to 138% of poverty. So the math is right there, and Medicaid is no longer prioritizing the most vulnerable populations. The status quo is leaving people like pregnant women and people with disabilities behind. In fact, there are currently more than 700,000 individuals with disabilities in America that are on a waiting list for care and services. I would urge you, go look at your state, ask your state, how many individuals with a disability are on a waiting list for care and services? 2/3 of these individuals are living with a mental or physical disability. In my home state of Washington, which is a Medicaid expansion state, there are almost 14,000 individuals today on a waiting list for care and services. In 2016, the Washington State Health Care Authority said, quote, Governor Inslee has set a course that enables Washington to deliver smarter, better care. This ongoing innovative work dovetails with the goals of Healthier Washington, exemplifying a systematic and thoughtful approach to providing high-quality care, controlling costs, and realizing better health outcomes. Unfortunately, it's not true. Access to Medicaid services is so bad, people with disabilities are told they're better off moving. This is the advice one disability advocate gives families, and I quote, I tell them to move to another state, do not come to Washington. Now imagine you are a parent raising a child with a disability, and you are told you can't count on Medicaid. It's quicker to move than wait for Medicaid to cover your child's wheelchair or home health aid. This is unacceptable. Hundreds of thousands of people waiting for care and services nationwide is unacceptable. It needs to be fixed. It is time to modernize Medicaid, to make sure it's sustainable and working for those that need it the most. The Healthy Adult Opportunity will improve Medicaid. It will improve the integrity by giving states the option. It's not mandatory. It's optional to innovate, provide coverage by enrolling in a demonstration program. We do this all the time. We encourage demonstration programs so that we can explore how we get better results. It will give the states the flexibility to control cost and share any savings between the states and the federal government that go back into Medicaid. States like Washington could put these savings directly back into a Medicaid program so that they can shorten waiting lists for people with disabilities. There are also patient protections in place. This option is for certain able-bodied adults only, not children, not seniors, not those with disabilities. It's not mandatory. It's not a cut. It will not strip benefits or limit eligibility. What it does is make the Medicaid program more transparent and more accountable, and most importantly, work to cover and actually provide the care to those who need it most. So again, House Resolution 826 does nothing to fix the fact that Medicaid may be covering more people, but the most vulnerable in America today are being left behind on waiting lists, hundreds of thousands of people. Unlike the Trump administration's leadership to empower states and improve care, this resolution does zero. Zero. It makes scoring political points more important than actually solving problems and offering new solutions. And that's a shame, because we can no longer afford this status quo. It's pregnant women, adults, and children with disabilities that are paying the price. And I just urge us all, to let's go to the table. We are all elected here to be legislators. We are all elected here to solve these problems. There's a lot of bipartisan work that could be done, should be done, as it relates to, in this case, Medicaid. And I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate you being here. Anybody on the panel have any questions? Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, just as a clarification, the shared savings concept, my understanding that's between 25 and 50% of the savings can be shared with the state. Now, that's not money that goes into the Road and Bridge Fund or the, it goes back into Medicaid.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
Exactly.
So it's hard to see why that wouldn't be a benefit in helping to cover the population that you've so carefully described today, and I think that's something we should be for.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate your being here. That ends the hearing portion on Res 826. We're now going to move on to HR 5687, the Emergency Supplemental Appropriations for Disaster Relief in Puerto Rico, Disaster Tax Relief for 2020. Nita Lowy, Kay Granger, Tom Swazi, Tom Rice. Swazi, you're up. Oh, Nita Lowy as well, and
right here.
Kay Granger.
Why don't you go in the middle, Nita?
Hello, how are you?
Where are you going, Tom?
You get this.
Oh, is Kay coming too? Is Kay Granger coming too?
She's on the list, but I'm not sure if she's coming. Benita, sit down and we can begin. Welcome. Mr. Rice, take a seat as well. Yeah. Chairwoman Lowy, we'll begin with you. Please feel free to summarize your statement if you'd like.
It is a pleasure
And make sure your mic's on too. Yeah.
for me to be with you. Okay. Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole, and members of the Rules Committee, it's a pleasure for me to be with all of you. Not you. Pleasure for me to be with all of you today. As we know, in recent weeks, thousands of families in Puerto Rico were forced from their homes. Schools were flattened, roads and infrastructure were severely damaged as earthquakes racked an island still struggling to recover from the devastation of Hurricane Maria and Irma. While President Trump has finally released some of the aid Congress appropriated for these hurricanes, more support is clearly needed. We must act now on our shared responsibility to assist Americans in need. The emergency supplemental before you would provide $4.67 billion in targeted assistance to help families and communities recover from these devastating earthquakes and puts Puerto Rico, good afternoon, on a better path to long-term recovery. It includes $3.26 billion in community development block grant disaster recovery funds, $1.25 billion for repairs to damaged road systems, $100 million to restart school operations, $40 million for disaster nutrition assistance in Puerto Rico, and more than $20 million to help address the island's energy needs. In addition, this bill would provide Puerto Rico with flexibility to use this funding in conjunction with earlier disaster relief resources. Critically, it also establishes safeguards designed to address the Trump administration's outrageous withholding of vital aid to Puerto Rico. This includes requiring detailed spending plans and mandating funding be released in a timely manner. Finally, we're carrying a number of tax-related provisions in the jurisdiction of the Committee on Ways and Means that would complement the emergency appropriations and support working families and encourage economic growth. Mr. Chairman, our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico need our help. With this bill, we can provide families and communities swift relief and put Puerto Rico on the path to long-term recovery. I request an appropriate rule to bring this emergency supplemental to the floor.
Thank you.
And I thank you.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Granger, welcome.
Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify on the Puerto Rico Disaster Supplement. This is our first appearance since we completed the...
Granger, pull the mic closer.
Oh, thank you. This is our first appearance since we completed the FY20 appropriations bill. I want to take a minute to thank Chairman Lowy for working in good faith to complete our process last year. Though we didn't agree on everything, we were able to reach bipartisan agreement on full-year appropriations bills to fund the entire government and avoid a shutdown. I hope that this spirit of cooperation and compromise will continue this year. Unfortunately, I'm concerned about the path we're on with the measure before us today. This bill is called an appropriations bill, but it has more than $16 billion in unnecessary tax breaks, largely unrelated to the recent earthquakes that hit Puerto Rico. Also included is more than $4 billion in new emergency appropriations, much of that for disasters that haven't happened yet. Puerto Rico has money for previous disasters that sit unused. Over the last 3 years, we have allocated more than $40 billion for Puerto Rico disasters, and less than half of that has been spent. As for recent earthquakes, the federal government has not completed the required studies and reporting on the extent of the damage. While I, too, have been frustrated with the amount of time it takes the federal government to distribute funds after disaster, appropriating funds before we know what is truly needed is not the answer. There are billions in the FEMA Major Disaster Relief Fund that are already available and can be used toward earthquake response and recovery efforts now, while we wait on a full and accurate report on the damage and estimated cost. When a disaster strikes, it's our job to ensure that the federal government is there to help those in need so they can recover and rebuild, but we also have a duty to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used in a fiscally responsible manner. Unfortunately, including tax breaks unrelated to disaster recovery and new unrequested funds for disasters that haven't even occurred is not a good use of funds. At this time, I do not think we should be reconsidering this bill. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Swazi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Thank you to all the members that are here today. I'm very happy to be here today with the Chairwoman and the Ranking Member and Mr. Rice to speak to you about much-needed appropriations in response to the recent disasters in Puerto Rico, but also to add to that, the Puerto Rico Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2020. These tax provisions will provide meaningful relief to workers and families in the territories, as well as direct assistance to Puerto Rico for housing and community development in wake of the recent earthquakes. Now, everybody likes the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. Democrats and Republicans recognize as one of the most effective ways to reward work. And they're some of the most effective and powerful tools to combat poverty in the United States of America. And it's time that we take these two concepts of the Earned Income Tax Credit and child tax credits and include the people that reside in Puerto Rico and the U.S. territories. It's only fair. This bill extends access to the refundable child tax credit to Puerto Rican families with one child or two. It's very discriminatory right now. Only people with 3 children or more are eligible for the child tax credit. This is to give them equity with the Americans here in the United States, that it also is eligible for children, people with 1 or 2 children in their family. It's a recommendation that was made in the 2016 Congressional Task Force on Economic Growth in Puerto Rico, and for other territories with tax credits, this bill provides payments to offset the fiscal impact to the territorial governments. For the Earned Income Tax Credit, the bill builds on the great work done by my friends Bill Pascarell and Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, and it provides a 3-to-1 match in federal funds to Puerto Rico and to territories that implement an Earned Income Tax Credit. In addition, this bill supports the reestablishment of an employee retention tax credit to help ensure that workers in Puerto Rico's earthquake disaster still get paid. And all of these provisions can help quickly to our fellow Americans in the territories. In addition to direct relief for its residents, the legislation calls for increases in Puerto Rico's housing tax credit ceiling by $50 million and for the low-income housing tax credit, and an additional $500 million for new market tax credit investments in 2020 and another $500 million in 2021. This tax relief provides critical aid for rebuilding after these devastating earthquakes, and the expansion of these proven community development tools will encourage the construction of hospitals and community facilities, especially in low-income communities in Puerto Rico. The bill will spur investments in new affordable housing throughout the territory, and like all Americans, Puerto Rican residents deserve safe, affordable housing. I urge my colleagues in the House to act quickly to deliver relief for Puerto Rico. We have an opportunity and the obligation to help our fellow Americans in the territories to get back on their feet after these terrible disasters.
Thank you
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rice.
Yeah, I live in coastal South Carolina, and we've had our share of disasters lately, so I'm not here to cast aspersions on disaster relief.
Is your mic on?
Yes, sir, it is.
Just put it a little closer to you.
Yes, sir. I'm not here to cast aspersions on disaster relief because I've lived it and I know its effect on people, but I just want to highlight a couple of things about this bill. First of all, in what we've done with Puerto Rico in the last few years, Puerto Rico from hurricanes Irma and Maria requested $94 billion in aid. That's compared to Hurricane Florence in South Carolina, a little under $1 billion in aid, $94 billion in aid. They had 400,000 FEMA applicants. That amounts to $200,000 per person. They've been awarded about half that, a little over $40 billion, about $100,000 per person. Actually been paid about half that, about $20 billion, which amounts to $44,000 per applicant. $44,000 per applicant, as opposed to Hurricane Michael in Florida, where the amount has been $23,000 as opposed to $44,000 in Puerto Rico so far. And there's a lot of money that hasn't been paid. You know, they've been allocated already $40 billion, $20 billion's been paid. So they've gotten $44,000 per person already. Now we're talking about adding onto that for these earthquakes, another $4 billion in aid on top of the 94 requested, $40 billion allocated, $20 billion paid. We're adding onto that another 4.6 or $7 billion. And then we're talking about these tax issues. Now, we're talking about extending, and these tax issues really have nothing to do with this disaster, and they're not a one-time thing that just occurs to relieve people of disaster. When we put these things into effect, they go on as continuing benefits for the people of Puerto Rico. That we want to extend the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Now, what this bill does even though people from Puerto Rico typically don't pay U.S. income taxes, okay? They don't file U.S. income tax returns. Now, some of them, if they have U.S. income, do. If they have outside income, they do. If they work for the U.S. government, they do. But other than that, the average Puerto Rican does not file U.S. taxes, doesn't pay U.S. taxes. But under this bill, the U.S. government would pay them the earned income tax credit as though they paid U.S. taxes. They're getting a credit against tax liability that they don't and will never owe, okay, for the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Now, it's difficult to put an exact number on what that amounts to, but on average, it would run about $4,400 per family. What they're telling the Puerto Rican government is, under your own tax code, we want you to put in an earned income tax credit, and that'll lower your tax revenues, but the U.S. Treasury will reimburse you for that. So the U.S. Treasury, even though these people don't pay U.S. taxes, the U.S. Treasury is going to pay the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, not just for this year for hurricane recovery, but on into perpetuity. So you can see how this would amount to it's $15 billion over 10 years, and it's not related to disaster relief. And, I wanted to offer an amendment to this. I was told, well, you can't really legislate in an appropriations bill, but it sure appears to me that we're writing tax legislation in this appropriations bill, okay? And Ways and Means should have jurisdiction over these tax provisions. There's never been a hearing or discussion or even a mention of this in Ways and Means. And all of this appears in this bill. If we're going to do this, it certainly should be subject to discussion and thought and debate in Ways and Means before it appears in this disaster mitigation bill, these tax provisions that will last on and on and on. Those two, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, are the biggest things, but we also put in $500 million in new market tax credits. Well, new market tax credits are designed to incentivize people to invest in depressed areas. That's what they're for. And we allow a certain amount of those dollars for the whole country every year. The last time we did it, 2019, it was $3.5 billion for the whole country, okay? Now we're talking about putting $500 million just in Puerto Rico as a result of this storm. So they would get 1/7 of the entire allocation for the whole country would be going in. I'm just trying to give you relative numbers so you would go to Puerto Rico. And then in addition to that, we would give them another $50 million in low-income housing credits. Well, let me tell you guys, I represent some of the poorest areas in South Carolina. Marion County, South Carolina is 57% African-American, 30% of the people live in poverty. They could use low-income housing credits. They've been hit 3 times in the last 5 years by hurricanes. They didn't get any extra allocation of low-income housing credits. And, I want to be, again, I'm not casting aspersions on disaster relief. I've asked for disaster relief. But gosh, $94 billion requested, $40 billion awarded, $20 billion paid already. And then we're talking about adding another $5 billion on, plus these tax credits that just go on forever. That just, the tax credits are certainly unrelated, and we just need to keep in mind the order of magnitude that we're talking about here. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any questions, Mr. Cole?
I have a few. First, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to place a statement of administration policy on this supplemental H.R. 5687 in the record.
Without objection.
Which the President, or the administration states President advisors would recommend a veto were this passed. And I just want to make a couple points. I actually agree very much with both my, well, you're all my friends, but with my distinguished ranking member and certainly with my good friend from South Carolina. I think this is just premature. I have no objections to disaster relief. I've routinely voted for that. I live in a state that certainly has its share of disasters, like my good friend Mr. Rice and my good friend Ms. Granger, and frankly all of us. We all have been there. but this bill is coming, I think, very prematurely. Just asked my friend, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, a couple of quick questions. Has the administration provided an initial damage estimate for the earthquake in Puerto Rico?
No.
So we're really acting, no FEMA report, no assessment. And I would tell you that's important to have. I worked hard on Sandy relief, honestly, where the assessment took a long time. It took 85 days, longer than anybody wanted. But the reason they took that amount of time, quite frankly, was to make sure we didn't shortchange the affected entity. I don't think we are shortchanging anybody here. The numbers, as Mr. Rice points out, are pretty generous. But we just shouldn't act before we actually have, the full range of damage in front of us here. Frankly, you do run the risk of either overpaying or underpaying simply by not doing your basic homework. Again, I'm going to ask the ranking manager, is there a shortfall in either the major disaster relief fund or the disaster relief fund that would necessitate a need for additional money for Puerto Rico?
No, there is not.
No, we've got money, literally sitting in both the base disaster relief fund, over $600 million, and then we have major disaster relief fund, that balances in excess of $40 billion in January. So why, again, the rush to do this when there's money on hand? I'm going to ask both, well, I'll keep it with Ms. Granger for right now, but I think you made this point, and certainly my friend Mr. Rice made this point. We voted, the last Congress voted $48 billion worth of relief. Point out for the record, as a Republican Congress, so there's certainly no opposition to giving it, and no debate about the need for it, in my view. But half of it's still unspent. And why would we start spending, either of you know why we'd spend money when we have money available, unspent, in both the Disaster Reserve Fund and money already reported from Puerto Rico, as opposed to going ahead now?
I agree.
So, again, that's my only point here, Mr. Chairman. We're proceeding here without, without the information we need to make an intelligent decision, with major resources already available that are unspent. It suggests to me this is a more, well, I'll leave it to my friends to decide whether it's a political exercise or not, but it's certainly not going anywhere. It's not going to be picked up by the Senate. It's not going to be accepted by the administration. And we'd be better off just to do our homework. I do have one question for my good friend, distinguished chairman of the full committee from New York. My understanding of this bill contains $1.25 billion for the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program, $3.26 billion for CDBG DR funding. Those funds aren't required by Puerto Rico. Is that correct? Or is there other funding in here for other programs?
As I understand it, after I've been to Puerto Rico, you talk about highways, roads, it is a mess. The needs are extraordinary. Now, I must admit, but I will get back to you, I cannot ensure for this distinguished group that that fund matches the incredible needs for the roads and highways. So I will check on that.
But
But
please.
I just want to say this in general. Now I got an answer.
Okay.
The federal.
Nothing like great staff, Madam Chairman.
Always. But let me just say, before I give you the answer to that, when I was there, the damage is quite extraordinary, and I wasn't there that long ago. And when you see the tarp still on the home, and you see the roads that you can't really move on, they're muddy and they're not passable, it seems to me, based on the expert information that was given to me as to what was needed and what is not needed, it makes a lot of sense for us to meet this request. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do oversight. I mean, we all have an important responsibility to oversight to make sure it is being spent appropriately. Now, in answer to your question specifically, the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program provides funding to to repair or reconstruct federal aid highways and roads on federal lands that have suffered severe or catastrophic damage. Currently, there are emergency relief project needs in 46 states and territories. The bill before you funds all unmet needs and provides additional funding for anticipated 2020 needs. Now, I must admit I haven't seen the need in 46 states and territories, but when I was last in Puerto Rico, you saw those roads. They're just not passable, and people still don't have a decent place to live. So based on the expert advice that I've been giving, this request seems to make sense. Does this answer your request?
I would interpret it as saying that there's money in here that's not necessarily for Puerto Rico, so that does answer my request. So I just want to make that for the point. And I visited Puerto Rico as well, Madam Chairman, and I agree with you. I mean, there's no question. I voted for those programs for relief. I believe it's necessary, but I also believe we got a lot of money that we haven't spent, we haven't obligated. I wouldn't go obligate more without a study on the earthquakes. We're not that far away from it. It's a 30-day study from FEMA. So I think we're proceeding here willy-nilly on something that we haven't done our homework on. We have other resources available, and we're certainly adding a couple of other items here that I don't know how seriously they've been looked at. Maybe the committee staff has looked at them. I don't think the full committee has had an opportunity to look at them. I know I haven't, but to be fair, I don't sit necessarily on the relevant committee for that. So I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. I think we're proceeding too rapidly here, and we got something, until we answer some questions, the administration at least is not going to sign it, and I don't think the Senate's going to pick it up. So we can have the debate, and again, we've got resources available. We ought to use them.
With great respect, Mr. Chairman, from my good friend, let me share some additional information. The bill provides 2 streams of community development block grant disaster recovery funding. There is $2 billion for any state or territory that has had a major disaster or will have in 2020. This funding is not limited to Puerto Rico. In addition, there is $1.26 billion in CDBG DR mitigation funding for 17 states and territories that experienced disasters in 2018-2019. Puerto Rico is not eligible for this funding because they did not experience a major disaster in 2018 or 2019. CDBG DR is important funding that allows communities in the most impacted and distressed areas of major disasters receive the assistance they need to recover from a disaster. And this is important, that the funds can be used to rebuild housing, businesses, infrastructure, and provide additional funding to ensure that structures are built more resiliently to withstand the impacts of climate change and severe weather events. So let me also add that CDBG funds in this bill are forward-looking. Last year, we had significant Midwest flooding. This bill will speed up CDBG DR funds wherever they are needed. Let me just say this in conclusion, unless you have another question. We know what we went through in several parts of the country with real disasters, real suffering. The fact that this money can be used, and we hope we don't have additional severe flooding, but for those who may not believe in climate change, there sure seems to be a lot of emergencies that can be attributed to climate change. And what's most important, because for me, when I was last there, is that we provide really good oversight. I don't think any of us, some who may support this, some who don't, just want to hand out the money. You want to be sure that the needs are real. But for those of us who've been there and see that the housing still hasn't been replaced, the schools still haven't been replaced, the suffering is enormous. And based on those who have the expertise and how this money can really be used, I think it is essential, so I would ask for your support.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree with my chairman, which I don't often do, but I will
And
in
I
this
always
case.
appreciate your willingness to express
I
things
have enormous,
eloquently.
enormous respect for the chairman and the ranking member of Appropriations, but a couple of points. I mean, first of all, the administration hasn't requested this aid. This has come full-blown up out of Congress. Second, as Mr. Rice pointed out, we're putting a lot of tax things in here that have not had a hearing in the appropriate committee, which we ought to do. Not saying they're wrong.
Will
Yes,
the gentleman yield for 1 second,
Certainly
Mr.
yield.
Cole? I just want to point out that we did mark up H.R. 3300 in committee in June of 2019, and that included both the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit for Puerto Rico.
Well, that's fine, but this specific package and all of its elements has not been subject. If I'm mistaken, please correct.
The most significant part of this is the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, and they were marked up as part of a markup in
But other
June of
parts have not
2019.
been, is that correct?
I think they have been, actually, but I'll
Have
get
they?
you
Well,
some more
maybe.
information.
It's still, I would actually still go with Mr. Rice's basic argument here. This is a permanent tax relief for a temporary disaster. So I think that's an idea worth exploring.
Let me just say one other thing respectfully,
Yes,
if I may,
sir.
Mr. Ranking Member, is that the people of Puerto Rico do pay Social Security taxes.
Yeah,
And the
right.
child tax credit is measured against Social Security taxes.
I have zero debate with that or dispute with that, and I'm not here to be critical of people of Puerto Rico at all. I'm really
No, I don't,
not.
I know that.
So this seems, again, we're talking a little bit in a vacuum here. This bill isn't going anywhere. Let's just be blunt. It's not going to be picked up by the Senate. It's not going to be signed by the president. I think
If
we'd
that
have
were
a
the
much-
case, though, we wouldn't do anything.
If I can finish my point, I think we'd have a much better chance if more aid is necessary if we just simply did our homework. We waited for the FEMA stuff. We made sure we spent some of the money we had. If some of these tax provisions are appropriate, I'm agnostic on this point. Look, I understand these are our fellow Americans, and they've gone through a really tough time, no question about it. I'm just not sure that we're proceeding in a way that's going to deliver them any tangible help, and I'm not sure we're not leaving a lot of resources on the sideline. My friend Mr. Rice had a point he wanted to make.
Yeah, if I could intervene on a couple of things. One is, I haven't been to Puerto Rico, and I haven't seen the blue tarps on the houses, but I have been to Marion County, South Carolina, which is one of the poorest counties in the country, okay? 30% of the people live in poverty, and there's plenty of blue tarps on the houses there, too. And we've already paid out to Puerto Rico $44,000 per FEMA applicant, $44,000. And South Carolina was awarded $13,000. Florida, Mr. Hastings, was awarded $25,000. So why we're in such a rush to add on to money, as you say, billions yet unspent in Puerto Rico is unusual to me. And then with respect to the tax credit, we marked up a bill that dealt with the earned income tax credit for the whole country, generally, not just Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was a part of that. This bill, we've never had any discussion of doing any kind of standalone bill on U.S. territories on the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. This is an enormous change in the tax code.
Let me just add this conclusion. You've been very generous with the time, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think some of these measures may be necessary. We just need to proceed in a prudent fashion here. Again, I tend to vote for disaster relief fund, and I don't get into comparison who gets what or whatever. You never know. It's hard to compute what the costs are in one place versus another. That could be very legitimate. And I have been, as my friend the chairman has, to Puerto Rico, and the damage is real. There's no question about that. So I want to talk about, when we've got unspent money, why are we putting more in until we do that? Maybe we should focus on that. Tax policy concerns me. It is legislating on an appropriations bill. I'd rather see a separate bill there, frankly, but again, there may be a good case for that. But until we persuade our friends in the Senate and the administration, and let's note for the record, most emergency relief comes because an administration has requested emergency relief. We don't kind of willy-nilly put together a package in Congress all on our own, and particularly not without talking to our friends on the other side or the President of the United States that has to sign it. So I think we're premature in this at best. I think there are other remedies in front of us that could work and actually help people in Puerto Rico. We get them money a lot faster by asking why money hasn't been spent that was already authorized and appropriated, as opposed to throwing more in that's not going to get there in all likelihood anyway. So with that, I continue to be very skeptical about the package, but interested in finding effective ways to help people in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hastings.
I'll be brief. First off, I am fully supportive of the measure. And one thing that should not be ignored is the President administration imposed severe restrictions back on January 15th on billions of dollars in emergency relief for Puerto Rico, including blocking spending on the electrical grid and suspending its $15 an hour minimum wage for federally funded relief work. The nearly $16 billion in funding released while Puerto Ricans still sleep on the streets for fear of aftershocks from the hurricane back in early January is part of $20 billion that Congress allocated for disaster relief in preparation more than a year ago. Let's use the Department of Housing and Urban Development as a for example. They had only released $1.5 billion of the congressional relief, citing concerns about political corruption. Of that, only $5 million has been spent. I won't carry on, Mr. Chairman, but like Mr. Rice, I live in one of those areas, as do all of us, where disasters are likely to occur. Fear and pain and treating people differently. It seems to me that when it comes to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, the territories, it's always something else that causes the money to not get where it needs to get to. And I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate Mr. Hastings' last concern. I'm sure there's legitimacy to that, and we've seen that from time to time. And I'm sorry that's not the discussion we're having. It pains me, as I have said so many times. I got two Republicans here who have supported every disaster bill that has come through Congress, saying I can't support this disaster bill that's going through Congress, and I don't understand why we put ourselves in this space. And Ms. Lowy, I come to you. It's not been 45 days since we signed a forward-looking appropriations bill. You're talking about language in here that isn't emergency supplemental. It is to fund forward-looking accounts for future problems. I applaud the committee. You all do that so successfully all the time. But my question is, nothing's changed in the last 45 days in those 46 states. And so why are we forward-looking and forward-funding today instead of having forward-looked and forward-funded 45 days ago, and then again when the new appropriations bill comes through later this year?
Well, first of all, and I'm going to give you some numbers again, but let me make it clear that as the head of appropriation, I didn't make up these numbers. I mean, there are agencies that have the responsibility to deal with disasters, past and forward. So whether it's the CDBG funds or other funds that are requested in this bill, they are being requested by those, they're not Democrats or Republicans, they're people who work in the agencies that have the responsibility to deal with it. Frankly, it upsets me that we just had a recent disaster again in Puerto Rico, and there were still people who were without houses, without jobs, without schools, and this is months, more than that, after the first disaster. So I am going to assure you that I understand the responsibility of making sure these funds are spent well and directed to the right programs. And I just want to mention again that these requests have come from the agencies that have the responsibility to do the work.
But presumptively, those requests came in the last appropriations season. I sit on the Budget Committee when I'm not on the Rules Committee, and so every time something deemed an emergency, called an emergency supplemental comes through, it raises my budget committee suspicions that we could have funded it under a regular appropriation cycle, but for some reason, we've chosen not to. And again, we praised the work product that appropriators did in partnership with one another just 45 days ago in response to all of those agency requests. Now, it could be that OMB or the White House has sent additional requests in the last 45 days that I'm unaware of, but I'm trying to understand. Again, happy to fund disaster relief, happy to vote yes on appropriations bills as I did just 45 days ago, but confused as we're trying to be responsive to administration requests for emergencies and be responsive to one another for deliberation, not just debate. Why in this package as opposed to in the package 45 days ago that we just partnered on?
First of all, let me say that as a thoughtful person, friend in the Congress, I wouldn't want you to be confused. And if there's additional information that you need, I'd be happy to forward to it. But it's my understanding that this bill conforms to the timelines and structure of the CDBG authorization bill that was passed on suspension in November. This is the information that I have. So based on that and based on the reports from the relevant agency that are charged to do the work, this is what I've been told are the needs.
That is music to my ears as an authorizer on transportation. So often I authorize it, and it doesn't get all the money I requested out of appropriations. I'm glad to see here in 2020 we're having a new conversation where everything that gets authorized then gets appropriated. But that troubles me as a budgeteer going forward. But I recognize that distinction. I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate that. As an authorizer who authorized these funds, I am very pleased to follow this process carefully and work with you to be sure the money is spent effectively. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, again, so many issues in this bill that are not ordinarily connected together that could have received bipartisan support. I just came out of a modernization committee meeting where the witnesses were testifying that our bills are getting longer, but the number of bills we're passing is becoming fewer as we put more and more unrelated things together into packages. And what that then reflects is, depending on the nature of that packaging, either more and more partisan divisions in the Congress or more and more horse trading in order to get things done in a collaborative manner. I don't see any evidence of the horse trading here today, which leads me to believe that we might be in the other spot. Thank you for your indulgence.
I would just like to say I think that is a very thoughtful comment, and perhaps in another conversation we could address your concerns.
I thank the chairwoman.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Mr.
it.
Chairman.
We have one more panel, that is Mr. Graves. Who else? No, this is not his. No, this is, yeah. Yeah. And without objection, I'd like to submit to the record a statement from the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee in support of her amendments to H.R. 5687. Yep. Mr. Graves, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Opportunity to come here. What you saw in that last panel was indicative of much greater problems we have in disaster policy. We made substantial changes in 2018 disaster recovery reform act, but much more needs to be done. And I think everyone here was largely right in their sentiments, but the solutions, I think, are probably somewhat compromised. Number one, Mr. Chair, as you've heard over and over again, there are billions billions of dollars that are available today for Puerto Rico. In many cases, there are problems with they're focused on previous disasters as opposed to the flexibility to be used for multiple disasters. If we can make investments that knock out two birds with one stone, we absolutely need to do that. Secondly, Mr. Rice laid out the tax concerns, and I think he's exactly right. Puerto Ricans do not pay taxes, and to suggest that Social Security taxes should be offset, that's not a tax. Those are taxpayer funds that are a user fee that go back to our retirement. Those shouldn't be considered a traditional income tax. I think that the better solution here on the larger bill would be for us to simply provide flexibility to FEMA to use and to HUD to use the previously appropriated dollars for the earthquakes that actually began in 2019 and continued into 2020, as opposed to putting additional funds into this process. We have filed 2 amendments to this legislation, both of which are indicative of the major problems with disaster response, primarily related to HUD. And Mr. Hastings, you noted, and there are many problems with the allocation of funds, but when a disaster happens, the money shouldn't sit in the bank. It needs to get to disaster victims. And you're right, whether it's capacity with the Puerto Rican government or problems with the federal government, we need to fix them. We have one amendment that sets aside 5% of the funds through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program to allow it for grants to individuals whenever they are not policy compliant. Let me give you 2 quick examples. Number one, FEMA has a base flood elevation to here. Someone may rebuild their home and comply fully with FEMA's base flood elevation. If you want a grant through HUD, through their Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, they have a different base flood elevation. This is our own federal family that has 2 different standards. You are ineligible if you complied with FEMA before HUD came in and established theirs. You're ineligible for funds. Why would we subject families to that, disaster victims to that? Secondly, another example is when you have someone that had to sell their damaged or flooded home because they couldn't afford to continue paying the mortgage on it and get an apartment or something else to provide housing for them immediately. So people sell their homes under current policy, they're ineligible for assistance. They still are suffering financial damages. So we set aside 5% for that purpose. The second amendment we have is an amendment that would fix a major flaw that HUD has carried out in the past several months related to duplication of benefits. Section 1210A of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act establishes that if someone got a temporary loan through this from the federal government for disaster recovery, that doesn't make them ineligible for a grant. There was some flawed policy that if you got a loan, you couldn't get a grant. Well, the grants come later. Why would you tell somebody that tries to lean forward on recovery that they can't get assistance through a grant? So just to play that out, if I sit back in a FEMA paid-for hotel room, and FEMA pays for my hotel room for 3 months, and then the grants become available, I can get a grant. If I lean forward and the only money was available was a loan and I took it, I'm later ineligible for a grant. HUD has totally trashed the law change we did to fix this. This administration has very much screwed up the law change. They have written things in their guidelines that aren't anywhere in the law. They've added new criteria. So our Second Amendment simply says that you can't introduce new income criteria and other things into the grant. If they were eligible for the grant without taking a loan, they should be eligible, while taking a loan, they should be eligible otherwise. Don't introduce new criteria into this. So I urge you to consider both of those amendments. I apologize that we did this very quickly and I didn't have the chance to get bipartisan co-sponsors, but I do think that they both have they would have bipartisan support. Lastly, I want to make mention of Congressman Fletcher and Congressman Crenshaw's amendment that tries to set $45 million aside to implement Section 1210A of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act and in the state of Texas. At first, I was very much opposed because I don't think the amendment that the law should require additional funds. But because of the extraordinary delay that it took HUD to issue the guidance on the law, I think that there is additional need. It's not because Texas screwed anything up. It's because HUD screwed things up. They took too long to comply with the law and issue guidance to states. So therefore, you have a bunch of victims out there that don't have assistance available. So I urge you to consider Congressman Fletcher and Congressman Crenshaw's amendment. I do think it's an anomaly that does deserve additional financial assistance.
Thank you
Happy to
very
take any
much.
questions.
Appreciate your being. Any questions, Mr. Graves? Mr. Promoter.
Yeah, we had a similar problem in Colorado when we had our floods where there were differences on the standards between FEMA, SBA, and HUD. Yeah. So SBA, you got to put them in there too. So I'd like to work with you on this subject sometime to figure out why we have these different standards, what the policies are, behind the different standards. Let's assume that there's something logical going on there, but I would appreciate a chance to work with you on it.
Well, thank you, and I'd love to work with you on it. HUD has just said that they're pushing for greater resiliency, so they have a higher standard. But love to work with you. We need to have a consistent.
Thank you very much. No other questions? Thank you very much. No other members wish to testify on H.R. 5687. Seeing none, that closes the hearing on this measure. We're now going to consider H.R. 2474, Protecting the Right to Organize Act of 2019. I want to welcome the Honorable Bobby Scott of Virginia and the Honorable Virginia Fox of North Carolina. We welcome you both. And Mr. Scott, you can begin. Hey, what do you want? Yeah. Sure.
I have two young women from a school.
Make sure your microphone's on. Yeah.
There are two young women here with me from a college in New York that I met one night very serendipitously, and they're shadowing me today.
Oh.
So this is their third committee meeting. They went to education, labor, and then to OGR, and now they're here. They've watched them today, so they're getting quite an education. And they told me they know the Rules Committee is a very powerful committee. They studied that in school.
Well, we want to welcome you all here, and yeah, and you must be exhausted shadowing Ms. Fox for the day.
They've had an interesting
Right.
day. But they started late. They didn't start till 10 o'clock. I was here at 6:30, so.
Mr. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be with you today as we discuss the H.R. 2474, Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. Everyone here agrees that hard work should pay off, but in today's economy, many Americans are working too hard for too little. While corporations are enjoying record-level profits, most workers and their families are struggling to keep pace with the rising cost of child care, education, housing, and other essentials. We must create an economy where workers can succeed. Throughout their history, America's labor unions have enabled workers to stand together and negotiate for a fair share of the profits they produce. When union membership levels peaked at around 30% of the workforce in the 1950s, rising worker productivity and wages rose together in lockstep. This helped create a strong middle class and allowed working families to achieve a basic standard of living. Union density has declined over the past 4 decades, and as that has happened, the link between rising worker productivity and higher wages has severely eroded. Between 1973 and 2017, worker productivity increased 73%, but inflation-adjusted wages only grew by 12%. Today, just 10% of American workers are union members, the lowest level since just after the National Labor Relations Act was created in 1935. This decline in membership is not only a product of this decline in union membership is not a product of worker choices. A recent study found that nearly half of non-union workers say that they would vote to join a union if given a chance. This gap between worker preference and union membership is a product of both intensifying anti-worker attacks and labor laws that fail to address unfair labor practices. Researchers from the Economic Policy Institute found that in 2016 and 2017, employers were actually charged with violating federal law in 41% of all NLRB-sponsored union elections. Similarly, employers were charged with illegally coercing, threatening, or retaliating against workers in nearly 1/3 of elections. The lesson is clear from the last 40 years that it is not workers no longer wishing to join a union, it is our labor laws are too weak to defend workers' basic rights to join a union and collectively bargain for their union. So the Protecting Right to Organize Act makes U.S. labor laws relevant to our times. The PRO Act makes many improvements, but here are the 5 key elements. First, it puts teeth into federal labor law by authorizing meaningful civil monetary penalties for companies that violate their employers' rights to organize unions or collectively bargain. Currently, the National Labor Relations Act has no civil penalties for violations, no matter how egregious, willful, or repeated the unlawful conduct. Most jurisdictions, a fine for double parking is greater than the fine for a corporation that a corporation would receive for violating workers' rights under the NLRA. That's because the employer is only, if they illegally fire somebody, the only fine is back pay reduced by whatever the employee earned. If the employee gets a job after they've been fired and makes about as much as they were making before, the employer doesn't know anything. Second, the PRO Act strengthens the worker's ability to negotiate with the employer. This does this by closing loopholes that many employers use to misclassify workers as independent contractors and evade any bargaining rights when there are joint employers controlling the terms and conditions of a worker's job. Third, the bill reverses the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in the Epic Systems in 2018, which held that employers can require employees to waive as a condition of employment their right to join in collective bargaining or class claims against an employer for wage theft or other matters. Fourth, the bill makes it possible for unions to represent their members more effectively. PRO Act allows unions and employers to voluntarily negotiate a provision in a labor agreement requiring a fair share for non-members, notwithstanding a state's right-to-work laws. Fair share simply means that all employees will cover the cost of collective bargaining, not union dues, but just the cost of collective bargaining and contract administration in so-called right-to-work states. To be clear, this does not require a union member to join a union as a condition of employment, but since unions have the legal responsibility to represent every worker equally, regardless of their membership, it is unfair to ask those workers who pay for representation to subsidize those who equally benefit but do not pay a fair share. And that equal benefit includes even individualized representation in grievance procedures. Finally, the PRO Act strengthens workers' rights to free and fair elections and requires their employers to respect the results. Today, workers seeking to stand together and form a union are forced to endure a process that is rigged against them from start to finish. Democracy in the workplace should be a right, not a fight. This legislation is grounded in the simple fact that it's supported by decades of evidence and research. When workers have power to stand together and form a union, they get higher wages, better benefits, safer working conditions. Research even shows that children benefit and non-union members also benefit, because when wages of union members go up, the non-union companies have to compete with those union wages for employees. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fox, welcome. Dr. Fox, welcome.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. It's always nice to see all of the members of the Rules Committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak against H.R. 2474, the Protecting the Right to Organize PRO Act. One of the largest unions in the country is currently embroiled in a massive federal investigation uncovering corruption and wrongdoing among its senior leadership. Federal law enforcement has charged or convicted more than a dozen high-ranking officials within the United Auto Workers Union, UAW, with money laundering, tax fraud, bribery, embezzlement, and other crimes, including violations of several federal labor laws. We also know that the largest federation of labor unions in America spends more than 3 times as much money in political activity as it does on its stated purpose of organizing and representing workers. It's no wonder union membership in the U.S. continues to plummet. Instead of self-correcting and increasing transparency and accountability to serve workers better, Big Labor is demanding Democrats pass the PRO Act, a sweeping bill that makes over 50 radical changes to federal labor law to appeal to union bosses and liberal Democrat primary voters at the expense of American workers. So what does this bill do? The PRO Act threatens employees' privacy. Specifically, it includes an invasive provision that requires employers to hand over reams of workers' private personal information to union organizers without workers having any say in the matter and without any assurances that unions will keep that information safe. The PRO Act will subject workers to increased harassment and intimidation from union organizers who will be responsible for the security of their personal information, which they'll use to target workers more easily. H.R. 2474 also overturns all state right-to-work laws, forcing millions of workers to pay hundreds of dollars per year to a union they do not want or need. This means workers would be coerced to fund union boss corruption as a condition of employment. To top it off, the PRO Act undermines workers' rights to vote by secret ballot and instead imposes a biased card check scheme in which workers could be unionized without the union winning a secret ballot election. Every member of Congress is elected by secret ballot. House Democrats elect their own caucus leadership by secret ballot, and Democrats even held up the USMCA trade deal to guarantee the right to a secret ballot for workers in Mexico. Yet they're willing to deprive American workers of that same protection by passing the PRO Act. But the bullying doesn't stop there. The PRO Act also allows unions to picket nearly any business in the country, eliminates longstanding employer rights during union negotiations, and expands the rights of illegal immigrants in the workplace. For the sake of American workers and small businesses, I have submitted several amendments that would make much-needed changes to this radical bill. One of my amendments rightfully empowers employees to have control over their personal information. Specifically, the amendment allows unions only to receive one piece of contact information, which would be chosen by the employee, instead of reams of private personal information being handed over to union organizers without workers' consent. Another amendment would update the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, to reprimand unions that engage in or encourage acts of violence by revoking their exclusive bargaining status and ensuring that the National Labor Relations Board cannot reinstate employees to the workplace who engage in violence. Similarly, another amendment would clarify that profanity or language that is derogatory on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, age, or disability is not protected activity under the NLRA, meaning employers would be allowed to suspend or fire workers for using such language. Union organizers should not be exempt from laws intended to protect civil rights and prevent workplace harassment. I'm also offering an amendment that would protect workers from being forced into Democrats' socialist Medicare for All scheme, where every American, including union members, are put into government-run insurance. My amendment would ensure workers aren't deprived of their union-negotiated private health insurance plans. Lastly, in light of the ongoing UAW scandal, I've submitted an amendment requiring unions to file more detailed financial disclosures with the Department of Labor if a union has had at least one president or vice president convicted of financial misconduct related to union finances within the past year. Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, there's good reason why the PRO Act is opposed by thousands of small business owners, trade associations, and free market organizations around the country. This radical, backwards-looking bill would diminish the rights of workers and employers alike while harming the economy and providing a political gift to labor union special interests. Despite claims to the contrary, American workers are benefiting from a booming economy thanks to Republican tax and regulatory reforms. Wages are rising faster for lower and middle-income workers, unemployment's at a 50-year low, and millions of jobs have been created since President Trump took office. Let's remember that federal law already protects employees' rights to organize, and Republicans respect that right. Any reforms to U.S. labor laws should help workers, not union bosses. The PRO Act fails miserably in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in support of her amendment to the PRO Act. Look, I want to thank both of you for being here. I mean, this is an issue where there's an ideological divide, unfortunately. But I will say this, that there are a lot of people out there who are working right now who aren't earning a livable wage, who are not getting the protections that every worker ought to have, in large part because they don't have the right to organize, or they're not able to organize. And, the president last night invoked SNAP, or as he calls them, food stamps, which he does regularly to demonize people who are on the benefit. But I just want to point out for the record that the majority of people who are able-bodied, who are on SNAP, actually work. But they earn so little, they still qualify for that federal benefit of food. So I think we can do better. But in any event, I am happy to yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask unanimous consent to place a statement of administration policy on H.R. 2474 into the record, which reveals that the President's advisor would recommend a veto with this legislation.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Just, I know we're in a crunch for time, so let me try to move quickly here, Mr. Chairman. And first, just for the record, let me just add, I took the President's remarks last night differently. I thought he was celebrating the economic success of having fewer people needing to receive food stamps. I didn't think it was a shot at people on food stamps they clearly need it. So that's just my view, and wanted to make that point. When these are two of my favorite members, when they come in, I always think it's the lion and the lioness laying down together. So, because I know they go after it. You get on. I just think it's a model of what Congress ought to be. I know you like one another personally. I know you differ on the issues, and when you bring us something where you agree, then we know it's been well thought through. When you disagree, you both have always good reasoning for your opinions. Not surprisingly, my good friend, the chairman, I find myself much more persuaded by the ranking member in this case than, I didn't want to unilaterally give my friend the right to repeal the right to work law in my state that I helped pass years ago and feel very strongly about. But let me ask you, Dr. Fox, you actually had a couple of things, and I'd like you to elaborate on them just quickly, places where you think this bill actually hurts the American worker, the average worker. I can see a lot of them where they're being forced to do things or reveal information that they might not want to do.
Every day I read in our press our concerns with Google and Facebook and all these organizations that are collecting personal information on people who use the devices. I am very concerned about the insult on our privacy. And this bill truly violates the privacy of workers in this country by forcing the employers to turn over to the unions all kinds of information on the employee. I just think that's wrong, and no guarantee at all that the unions will safeguard that information. I think that's one of the worst things that we're going to have happen. The other thing is to do away with right to work. As you said, 27 states have right to work laws, so you can't be forced to join a union if you don't wish to join a union. And I think if you look at the economic health of different states in this country, you'll see the right to work states are the ones that are doing really, really well right now. So those are a couple of the things that I would say to you. And I understand what the chairman said. He corrected himself. He said, started to say they need the right to organize. Well, they have the right to organize now. But the unions spent less than 0.1% of their money trying to organize American workers in 2018. I don't think they're trying very hard. I think they're turning to the Congress to say, you make it easy for us. You just let us be able to go out there and put people into unions without their voting for them. We'll get their privacy information. We'll harass them until they join. So this is not good for workers. It's good for the unions, but it's not good for workers.
And if you have a point you want to make, Chairman.
Let's start with privacy. We don't force people to do anything that they aren't already forced to give up now. Under the Trump administration, NLRB, we're codifying what they are doing. They've had 3 years to change it. They haven't done it.
Okay, Thank you very much. One of the things that concerns me about this is the so-called joint employer thing. We all represent a lot of franchisees, and in many areas, particularly some of our poorest areas, they are really the business community in many places. They create a lot of jobs. It's a classic American model. It's something I think this country's done well. What are the changes in this legislation, Ms. Fox, that you think might threaten those types of small businesses?
Well, we're already seeing it out in California. The law's been changed out in California to force people who work for Uber, Lyft, and other groups like that to be considered employees. We live in a country that cherishes entrepreneurs. And we go out there every day and talk about people gaining skills so they can go to work for somebody, then eventually own their own business. And what this would do would be basically do away with entrepreneurship and independent contractors. And it's not working. There's protests already in California against it. I'm not sure why people didn't wake up when the bill was going through the legislature out there and stop it, but it's a very, very bad model, and it would incorporate the California legislation. And even worse, because at least California, some people lobbied for carve-outs. This gives no carve-outs to people. And, yeah, it gets rid of it forces everybody to be an employee, not allowed to be an independent contractor.
Well, I think she answered another question. You asked the question about the joint employment. We just codified the common law that was in effect. Basically, if you're going to organize and negotiate, you ought to be able to negotiate with the person that's controlling the salary. If the employer controls the salary, so gives a contract to the temp agency, says you can't pay more than this, it makes no sense to negotiate with the temp agency because you're not negotiating with the person that has the power. So the common law, if you control the situation, you ought to be on the hook. On the independent contractor, there is a great incentive to misclassify people as an independent contractor rather than an employee. You get out of a lot of stuff. You get out of minimum wage and overtime. You get rid of the ability to organize. You get rid of unemployment compensation, workers' compensation. But in the right to organize, if you misclassify people as independent contractors, you don't have to recognize a union. They don't have the right to, independent contractors don't have the right to organize. What this does is codify the a law that's in most states. They have what's called an ABC test, certain criteria. If you pass that test, you're an employee, and if you fail the test, you're an independent contractor. She mentioned California. California is the most recent state to do it, but most states have the same kind of criteria.
Please.
May I come back, Mr. Chairman? You're correct. I was not focused on the joint employer. This would take us back to the bad Obamacare Obama rules. That would be terrible for joint employers. I apologize.
No need to do that for either of you. Let me end with one last question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly to you, Chairman, and the ranking member. One of the things that concerns me the most about this legislation is I'm a big believer in secret ballots. We all vote secret ballots in our caucuses around here. We believe in the secret ballot. That's the exact opposite of card check. It really puts somebody in a position to be pressured. So, Mr. Chairman, am I wrong about that? Do you think secret ballot rights are protected in here, or do you have the same concerns about
They're
card
protected unless the employer commits unfair labor practices and essentially sabotages the election. Then the union would have the opportunity to go to card check to get to move forward. When the absence of unfair labor practices, you get the secret ballot.
Let me suspect that Ms. Fox may have a different.
It's card check. It is card check. It's a very convoluted way of putting it into the legislation to get to card check, but it's basically card check. And, the chairman mentioned how many lawsuits there were brought against employers or complaints made against employers. I think he said 40% and 30%. they're very frivolous claims that are brought. It's very easy for the unions to bring up a claim against an employer and then be able to go to card check, and that's exactly what they're talking about. Almost a very small percentage of the complaints that are made are upheld by the NLRB.
Could I make
Sorry,
one
yeah,
comment?
certainly, Mr.
When I
Chairman.
said charges, that means NLRB has brought the charge. It's not that the claim was made.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have about 6 minutes left of this vote. Any further questions?
Mr.
Hastings?
Chairman, unanimous consent to include National Nurses United opposition, in support of this measure, and SEIU's letter in support of this measure.
Without objection. Any further questions? Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Fox, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you bringing the two young people involved in your training program to the Rules Committee. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. This is from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and they are obviously strongly opposed to this legislation. In fact, they are key voting this for their annual scorecard, so I would like to make this part of the record.
Without objection. Further question, Dr. Lesko. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, I just want to say I'm concerned about a lot of these factors, but one of the things we didn't talk about a lot was the independent contractors. And I had in Arizona a roundtable forum of women business owners in the direct marketers like Mary Kay Cosmetics, that type of thing, and also travel agents. And this would affect them adversely. They'd be qualified or categorized as employees. So I just think this is not good.
Thank you. Further questions? Ms. Torres.
I'm sorry, I know that we're pressed on time, but I think some of the comments that we have heard are pretty ridiculous, especially as issues regarding union bosses have come up. You know, there's been members of Congress that have pleaded guilty in campaign finance, guilty of illegal stock tips. But that doesn't mean that their constituents, you know, are bad. And, you know, for people to say that, you know, a union boss, the leadership of a union, you know, it makes the entire labor organization a toxic, you know, group of people, I think is ridiculous. I was a union member for 17 and a half years as a 911 dispatcher. As a 911 dispatcher, we had absolutely, you know, very, very, very little rights. I couldn't even get up and go to the bathroom without asking permission because someone needed to come and literally relieve me from my desk in order to be able to take a quickie and use the bathroom or take a drink of water to take medicine or anything like that. So, you know, unions are not about the leadership. And I say that strongly because several of the local leadership in my congressional district do not support me. But this is not about the union leadership. This is about the workers that deserve to have a right to organize. California would not have raised the minimum wage if not for workers getting together and organizing themselves. Now, I have never earned a single dollar as a paid member of any union.
Yep.
I have been a volunteer shop steward, and I have won every single claim that I have challenged management against my coworkers because management was wrong. Not because we found a loophole to protect anyone, but because management was wrong. In many instances, many of these workers would not have an opportunity to have a voice, to negotiate health care benefits, to negotiate any retirement, or to negotiate a wage increase, if not for being in a union. I also graduated from the National Labor College, you know, which was paid in part by a coalition of unions that thought it was important to educate their members Why? So that members can apply for positions and be able to lift themselves by their bootstraps and get better raises, better wages, and maybe a different job title. So it's very offensive to me when we pull the leadership of the unions with the workers of the unions. This is about the workers. This is about their right to be able to represent themselves, to be able to organize. And if we have a disagreement, a personal disagreement with a union boss, that's our disagreement. But this has nothing to do with union bosses. This is about the workers, and I support this bill, even though I do not have the support of many of the leadership members in my district, and I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No one knows more about lifting themselves up by their bootstraps than the gentlelady, Dr. Fox. I just wanted to ask if anybody had a response that they needed to make. If not, I'm happy to yield back, and we'll move on.
I'll make one quick comment. Mrs. Torres knows I have great respect for her, and I am so glad she had a good experience, and she did. And I'm not saying there are not some good experiences. I am not saying that all union leadership is bad, but we have enough examples to show that we need accountability, and that's what we're looking for. So I am so happy you had a good experience. I know some people who didn't have such good experiences. So God bless you.
Can I say something, Jack? Sorry.
I would be happy to yield.
Thank you so much. Just a second. I just want to tell you that I have been on the other side too. There's been independent expenditures against my campaigns from union leadership where members didn't agree either. But that's okay. This is not about the leadership of any union. This is about giving, workers the right that they deserve to organize.
I knew if I gave Virginia Fox one more chance to speak, we'd find common ground, and I was not disappointed. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There are no other questions. Thank you, Mr.
Just very briefly,
Yeah.
I just wanted to, for the record, indicate support for the Jackson Lee amendment.
Without objection. All right, thank you very much. You are free to go, and that closes the hearing portion on H.R. 2474. The chair will now be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Mr. Chairman, I'll read as quickly as I'm capable.
Okay.
To realize your dream. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant Resolution 826 expressing disapproval of the Trump administration's harmful actions towards Medicaid.
Gentlemen, suspend for 1 second. We've got to make sure that the stenographer can take down your words. So, okay, thank you. You may continue.
A closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the resolution. The rule provides that the resolution shall be considered as read. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2474, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act of 2019 under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking member of the Committee on Education and Labor. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and Labor, now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part B, I should say, of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each amendment made in order may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for the division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 5687, the Emergency Supplemental Appropriations for Disaster Relief and Puerto Rico Disaster Tax Relief Act of 2020 under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill and provides that Clause 2E of Rule 21 shall not apply during consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment shall be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. All points of order against the amendment printed in Part C of the report are waived. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You heard the motion from the gentleman. Any amendments or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Just one quick one, and I'll not belabor the discussion. Mr. Chairman, you haven't had a chance to do an open rule all year long. I want to give you that opportunity one more time in this Congress. So propose an open rule.
You heard the amendment from the gentleman. Any discussion or comments? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call, Mr. Chairman. I wish your friends would help you out. Give you this chance.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule, make an order and grant the necessary waivers for amendment number 11 of H.R. 2474, offered by Ms. Stefanik of New York. This amendment strikes the provision that significantly narrows the independent contractor status by defining a worker as an employee unless the following criteria are true. He or she is free from control and direction in connection with the performance of the service, both under the contract and for the performance of that service. And in fact, the service is performed outside the usual course of business of the employer, and the individual is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business of the same nature as that involved in the service performed. So Ms. Stefanik's amendment is straightforward. I think it would be a valuable addition to the underlying legislation, and I submit it for the committee's approval.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any comments or questions? If not, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 15 to H.R. 2474, offered by Mr. Rooney of Florida. This amendment amends the National Labor Relations Act to protect religious organizations.
You heard the amendment from the gentlelady. Any comments? If none, if not, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 19 to H.R. 2474 offered by Mr. Smucker of Pennsylvania. This requires unions to receive express consent from a worker before using his or her union dues for purposes other than collective bargaining.
You heard the amendment from the gentlelady. Any comments? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Askin? No. Mr. Askin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Are there any other amendments or discussion? It's not agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion? Hearing none, then the question is now on the motion from the gentleman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Askin? Aye. Mr. Askin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. And Mr. DeSaulnier will handle it for the Democrats. And I want to thank everybody for working so that we didn't have to come back. I appreciate it very much. I know, my dream has been fulfilled. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.